Hello and welcome. My name is Adrienne Fast. I'm the curator of art and visual culture at the Reach Gallery Museum. I and my colleague Diana Hiebert, who is the curator of learning and community engagement, are joining you today from Sol Timuch in the unceded Stolo territory of the Samath and Mathui First Nations. And we're very happy to be here with 4 of the artists who are included in our exhibition Ever Elsewhere, Citing a Mennonite Imaginary. We welcome Lois Clausen and Emily Neufeld, who are located in the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people in Vancouver and North Vancouver. So Lois Clausen's contribution to the exhibition Ever Elsewhere is Reading the Migration Library, a publication project and growing archive of chapbooks and zines that was begun in 2016 to generate cultural production that responds to the topic of migration in all its diversity. For each book, Clausen collaborates with different authors and artists to develop, write, and publish small accessible artist books that demonstrate the importance of learning from many migration narratives to give a broader understanding of migrant experiences. And Emily Neufeld's practice looks at layers of memory and traces of psychic history accumulating in particular domestic spaces. Her installation Before Demolition is made up of vinyl photographs applied to the walls of the gallery that together create an optical illusion of a house slated for demolition. Her other work in the exhibition is titled Motherlands, and it investigates her own family's migration and questions the way migration and settlement have been memorialized in Mennonite memory and history. And then I'll hand this over to Diana.
Hi, everyone. So we're also welcoming Emily Atkins, who is in Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, in the traditional territory of the Cree peoples and the homeland of the Métis. Atkins' practice frequently involves film, fabric-based sculpture, and performance, and often follows female protagonists living within matriarchal societies. Atkins' work in Ever Elsewhere centers on a folkloric matriarchal society that brings to mind the old worlds of the Mennonites and Duke Boers who settled in the North Saskatchewan River Valley. And her film Requiem for Wind and Water follows conjoined twin sisters who battle a witch to seek vengeance for the death of their mother. Roller Skates and Pink Dot is a nod to Atkins' fairy tale world, where roller skates are not so much a symbol of play as they are a tool for moving an army of girlish troops into battle against a witch. Finally, the Diamond Eye Assembly, a map of locations, is comprised of real and fictitious locations that are featured in her films and activate the fantastical and asymmetrical chronology of her filmed fairy tale. And finally, also Candace Friesen, who is in Montreal, which long served as a meeting place and site of exchange amongst many nations and is recognized as the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka and the Anishinaabeg First Nations. Candace Friesen's practice is anchored in diasporic language, dispersed translations, and disintegrated archival forms. And working across video, sound, sculpture, and text, her compositions build from architectural, material, and spectral inhabitations of exile, amplifying minute and myriad histories at once. Friesen has 3 works in Ever Elsewhere. The first is When Everything Comes Together, This Too Is a Refrain, which is a large installation work of sculptural support and quilted text written in Plotich or Mennonite Low German. The second is Dushanbe, and it's a short experimental video which narrates her great aunt's conceptual art practice of exile, invoking her home landscapes of Tajikistan in her South German living room in Darmstadt. Dau Dienst Dau Telt, translating to The Thing That Holds, is a limited edition flexographic printed edition of plastic bags that pay homage to the prolific use of knockoff designer plastic bags in Ukrainian public markets.
As I mentioned, you 4 artists, along with also Karina Wolf and Clint Neufeld, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, are all included in the exhibition Ever Elsewhere, which explores actual and imaginary borderlands and how migration has shaped notions of identity and cultural belonging. So I want to thank you all for being with us here in this virtual space. My first question to you is really about the thesis for this exhibition. When Diana and I were talking and selecting artists that we wanted to work with, we worked according to the criteria artists of Mennonite heritage, rather than Mennonite artists. And so our first question is how each of you feel like you relate to those different labels. Is it something that you embrace or something that you struggle with? And to what extent do you feel that in your individual practices, your Mennonite heritage comes to bear, if it does at all? So perhaps I'll ask Emily, since you're right beside me on the screen, maybe you can answer that question.
Sure, yeah. I growing up, Mennonite, I was always part of my identity. We would, visit my grandparents and have FOSPA and stuff like that. But it was always I was always a little bit embarrassed of my Mennonite heritage, and I would kind of play up my mother's Scottish side of the family. So I think everyone was a little surprised in my family when I, embarked on this project, sort of researching my Mennonite heritage. And I was also a little surprised to find how much my identity really lines up with kind of Mennonite thinking. I like to work large. I like to build things. I get great satisfaction from growing things and gardening, and, kind of digging into it more, I found a lot more like empathy and love for my Mennonite roots, for sure. This project is the first time I've made art specifically about my Mennonite heritage. I think kind of diving into, some of the complicated issues of our times, like the fact that we are living on stolen lands and the fact that, we are all settlers in Canada and colonizers. I sort of found that the best way to approach thinking about these things is to look at my own history as a colonizer and kind of learn about how my family and ancestors sort of came to be here. And also Mennonites had some interesting other ways of conceptualizing community and how they lived. And so there's some interesting, parallels as well with other more communal ways of living together and taking care of the land that I found really inspiring and interesting kind of as I was diving into some land use and domestic space kind of themes in my artwork. So I found it to be quite rich ground for some of the exploration, some of the thinking I was doing around domestic space and land use and being guests in so-called Canada. I also found that my working methods, which are large and heavy and difficult, and my big boned wrists came in very handy. So I was very grateful for my Mennonite heritage there as well.
Thank you. Lois, would you care to join in and give your thoughts on being either an artist of Mennonite heritage or a Mennonite artist, or both or neither?
Thanks. I appreciate the question, actually. I think you were pretty astute to make that distinction. I have to identify as someone of Mennonite heritage. It's the only heritage I have. And my partner, my husband, is also of Mennonite heritage. And we have a couple of kids ourselves. So, we're continuing on this heritage or ancestry, I guess. And I do think about it a lot, and I certainly don't identify as a practicing Mennonite. And that's because it's so quite closely tied to what's in some cases very fundamentalist Christianity, and in some cases less so, but it certainly is a sort of contemporary Christianity now, where people have really kind of specific rituals even to enter into the Mennonite faith. That is the religious context that I was raised in. So I understand how important it is to some people and family members. So I want to respect that. It's not the practice that I have right now, but it was what I was raised with. And then, the whole question about how it's it really amazes me that that you've brought us together and that you're interested in hearing our reflections. I would say I've never before been asked about my reflections on my Mennonite heritage.
Really? That surprises me.
Yeah, especially, well, you know, maybe people have asked me privately a bit about it, but not in terms of being an artist or
Right.
producing art. But it's astute because, yeah, it's there are many, many influences on my work and life practices otherwise. And now it's so delightful this summer. I think I mentioned to Adrienne, there's been a number of publications that have come my way about Mennonite history that's taken from the perspective of people who are really looking carefully at Mennonite backgrounds and where they're at today. So, and also taking more of a sort of cultural studies perspective. So looking at it not in a religious context. And for me, that's really informative because that hasn't come my way before. So it's all in a theme right now.
I think that was something that Diana and I were very aware of and thinking about when we were planning the exhibition. Being in a place like Abbotsford, which has a significant Mennonite population, but wanting to put together an exhibition that challenged and questioned some of those stories that Mennonites tell themselves, that become part of our cultural understandings of what it is to be Mennonite. So pushing the boundaries a little bit. And luckily all of you artists do that really well. So I thank you very much. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Lois? Or otherwise I might ask Candace.
Yeah, go for it.
Candace, how do you feel about these titles, and how do you feel, if you do at all, that your Mennonite heritage comes to bear on your work? I suspect that you think it does, but please, I'd love to hear from you say how you think it does.
It's a really interesting question, and I would normally not use the term heritage to use the term Russian Mennonite, which is how I would describe myself. It's kind of the most accurate description, as Lois mentioned. It's the only heritage I have. It's my ethnic identity and my inheritance. And heritage, when I was looking up the word, it denotes a condition or a state inherited from ancestors. That's the definition of the word. So to think about what my inheritance is, it's through my father as a Russian Mennonite architectural historian. My mother has a very interesting kind of DIY conceptual practice. My aunt is an artist, my uncle's a carpenter, my grandparents all had material practices, many of which I would consider resonant with a lot of practices right now, but were not recognized as such. And so I've inherited this kind of wide array of Russian Mennonite culture from my direct family and from the culture I grew up in, the church I grew up in, which I left. And as I keep returning to Ukraine and doing work in Ukraine and visiting with my cousins and family who are exiled to Central Asia, and really work in the region, the former Soviet region, it's really been expanding my concept of what our culture is, and my own family's culture and our wider culture of Ruslander, like later Russian Mennonite immigrants or participants in the colonial structure of Canada. And thinking about what that term even is, I rarely use Russian Mennonite to describe myself, but it is the thing that would be the accurate description. But like a lot of these kinds of ethno-heritage descriptions, it kind of fails, like Italian or Ukrainian or anything, or Canadian. It denotes to nation state, and it doesn't allow for the texture and complexity of different nations, indigeneity, a whole bunch of different aspects of relating to a specific territory or land. But again, it is my inheritance that I come from the Russian Empire. So it's like an interesting issue with temporality, these kinds of words and terms. And it also doesn't hold a relationship to diaspora, which we are inherently diasporic. And
or Russian Mennonites are inherently diasporic. And as is maybe, it's been present in our conversations and maybe clear in my work in the show, that I work a lot with the Russian Mennonite language, which is also a diasporic language. And most Western European languages that we know today are tied to nation states, and that was a very deliberate tool to build and consolidate power. And a language like Plotich or Russian Mennonite Low German dissipate and changes and has never been standardized, and changes from person to person almost. So I really look to the kind of formation of us relating. There's even a saying in the Russian Mennonite language, our only homeland is our mother tongue. So this idea that our only territory, or the place we come from, a lot what Emily was saying about this kind of idea of resonance or communal living, I really look to like the early aspects of Russian Mennonite beginnings, to the eschatological moment, the revolutionary moment of the Reformation, to think about what the possibility is of what this term could mean. So I guess a lot like my research, I go like very far into like acute moments of this term, and then also to just a general, it's a kind of ease of descriptor. The other way that it fails me in terms of description of who I am is it doesn't make a specific reference to how we participate in the construction of whiteness and settler colonial culture and power structures in Canada. So I'm really interested in its failures and the ways in which ethno-cultural identifiers or terms are used to kind of keep an idea of like a multicultural mosaic, or in a colonial country specific to Canada, how it fails, and like what time periods it refers to, and how I'm constantly, I guess, changing my relationship to what that term means.
That was again something that we've talked about, both Diana and myself, and I think individually with each of the artists, is when we were trying to come up with the title for the exhibition, and the idea of the Mennonite people as being a people that exists in almost constant migration, and the idea of migration itself perhaps being a kind of territory or a place of belonging. But the idea of ever elsewhere in the exhibition title is meant to refer both to the idea that Mennonites perhaps see themselves as always existing in relationship to people and places and stories that are ever elsewhere, but the idea that the Mennonites themselves are ever elsewhere, this idea that we are in the world but not of the world, and that has the potential to divorce some Mennonites from the responsibilities that they have as settler colonialists in a place like Canada, that they're not involved in politics, that they're pacifists, and so these things that have happened are divorced from the Mennonite sort of cultural understanding of themselves. So that was also something that we tried very hard to push back against. It worked out that we actually had this exhibition on display at the same time that we have an exhibition about the draining of Sumas Lake, and Indigenous perspectives about land stewardship, that we can then put in really interesting dialogue with Mennonite ideas about perhaps claiming the land through working the land. And so having these different worldviews in dialogue with each other in the space has been really fruitful. But all of these things are questions that we're still working through and thinking about. I don't think Diana or I suspect none of the rest of you artists think that there's sort of a final answer to that, but just ideas that we wanted to keep talking about, and to not close off that Mennonite identity, but instead to keep opening it up to these different points of dialogue. Was there anything else that you wanted to add there, or otherwise, Emily, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the labels of Mennonite artist or artist of Mennonite inheritance, and how you feel that comes to bear on your work.
Well, this is the first time I've been situated in this way. I feel like this is sort of like coming out as a Mennonite.
You've been outed, I'm sorry.
It hasn't come up for me, or I haven't really brought it up with my work ever before. So, I mean, and the project that is in the exhibition well, it's not the only project that's touched on, you know, things from my past. Like I grew up in a Mennonite church, you know, during art school. That was never something I engaged with. It took quite a while before I realized the richness of all of this material. So I was brought up in a pretty straightforward Mennonite church, but my mom was quite evangelical. So I had this, you know, these two opposing sides of religion. And I found where I sat within it was in observation. And so there's aspects of formality that show up in the work, and then these aspects of spontaneity and imagination that show up in the film. So, and currently I'm working on a film with my Aunt Agatha, who's gonna appear right here.
Hi, Agatha.
And so I've been visiting her every season on my grandparents' farm, which is in Manitoba, and it's one of the long slots of land that was previously owned by Métis people. So it's interesting. I mean, my grandparents died, and she's taken over the farm and taken over growing this large crop of Russian sugar beans, which my grandpa had started. So she's, you know, working this legacy, but she's 86, and so, you know, her time is coming to an end. But what I've been, who was saying about material practices, when I spend time with her, it's like I see, you know, everything she does is almost a type of performance, whether it's setting the table or carving a watermelon or making pierogies or what's the other one? The dough that's fried. What is it?
Brokuchen.
Yeah, that's it's all, it seems to me all very performative, and so I see her almost like a performance artist, and the aesthetic of her life and the color choices she makes with everything. I mean, in the film, every object she has around her it will seem like I planned it, but everything is from her environment. I'm totally getting way off topic about heritage and Mennonite. It's been interesting for me to dive right into her world and feel the presence of my grandparents and feel the effect of her on me. And I guess it's a rich place to come up with stories. And so this is the first time I've done, that's a lie. The second time I've done a documentary or approached something like a documentary. But there's still this ability to play with reality, and, you know, often we're staging certain circumstances. Or, you know,
How much of your work is about blending that, like, truth storytelling with sort of folklore and sort of more magical elements as well? So I could imagine that you would carry that forward into more straightforward documentary filmmaking as well.
Yeah, I'm picking out or getting her to talk about certain aspects that hit that line of strangeness, I guess. Like there's one story she tells, well, maybe I should stop talking, but she talks about her little sister looking out the window during a storm and saying, I wish that tree would come down. And then a few minutes later, lightning struck the tree and the tree came down. Wow. So there's a really strange quality to the land they live on that you feel when you're there. It's a little bit haunted, I think. Like, it just...
For sure.
That's the best way I can describe it. And so that's, you know, my grandparents lived there probably since the 1940s. And part of the project is to look, I haven't done this yet, but to find out, previous to them owning this property was another Mennonite family. And prior to that, I don't know. Like, there's an archive that I'm hoping and will have the information. So I am interested in the land and who was originally there. You know, what is the history of not only Auntie Agatha's life on this land and my grandparents, but how far back can I track this? That doesn't really answer your question.
Okay, but I find it interesting that like several of you, some said that this is like the first time like you're being outed as a Mennonite, like this is the first time that you're sort of put into an exhibition with other Mennonite artists. And obviously Diana and I, we chose artists not just because they come from a Mennonite background, but because their work deals with these issues of migration and language and cultural belonging as well, whether that's through a particular Mennonite lens in your own work, but it still speaks to these larger issues that anyone could appreciate. But it's interesting because I think there's this idea that Mennonites don't become artists. And in fact, there's lots of Mennonite artists out there. Talking about, as you say, like about material culture, that Mennonites are always making and creative and those things. It's just perhaps going to art school, you know, it maybe took a couple of generations before that became like a path that was more acceptable to funnel that creative practice and that material practice into. I suspect there's also, especially like in the art world, there is perhaps an avoidance of sort of identity politics exhibitions around groups that are Christian and white. And so perhaps for that reason, there hasn't been groupings of Mennonite artists together. But because we are in a strong, large Mennonite community, it seemed like this was the right place to do this in order to bring these artists together to raise some questions about these stories that Mennonites tell themselves about our cultural belonging and who we are and what we're about. So I thank you all for your answers. I appreciate it. And I'm going to hand it over to Diana to bring up the next question.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your answers. I know that there's a lot more to each of those answers. So we've just, you know, kind of touched on the surface in terms of the conversation. So my question kind of relates more to how the exhibition, the timing of the exhibition. So this exhibition has been a long time in development. As you know, Adrienne and I first started talking about it together more than 2 years ago. And my research into the topic extends much further back than that. Of course, we could not have predicted that when the time came for the exhibition to finally open, we would be living through the current historical moment that we are, with not only a global pandemic, but also with the urgent and ever-growing demands for racial justice. If it's possible, can each of you speak to whatever extent you're comfortable doing so on how you and yourselves are dealing with this year that is 2020 and how current events are impacting your work? And so perhaps, could I go to Emily first?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, the pandemic for sure has, you know, restored some of our interest in the domestic space and also in land use and food security. And some of these topics, I think, you know, in some ways, things that I've been thinking about for a long time almost have a new resonance or like a sort of different, but also like certainly some of these ideas around migration and around, you know, like these great things that everyone's been talking today about, you know, heritage and diaspora and migration, and just our identity as well. And I think it's very difficult to wade into some of these topics, but I think we can't talk about racial justice until we talk about whiteness. And I think that talking about colonization and talking about settlerism is an incredibly important kind of place to start. And we need to make room for that in our practices and in our thoughts and in our reading as well, because, you know, it's two sides of the same coin, and you can't really raise something up without maybe bringing something else down and finding an equilibrium a little bit. So
Definitely.
yeah, I think it's really timely kind of discussions. And I think that kind of what Candace was saying about Mennonites being constantly on the move, and also, you know, there's a deep lore of oppression in our heritage and in the way we think and talk about how we have moved around the world. And I think that can lead to empathy and to an understanding of other ways and other groups of people that have been forced to kind of move and migrate, and also, you know, land that has been given and taken, and that we were thrown out of places and then also given places to live, and by being given places to live, we were pushing others off of those places. So I think that it's a great and that's kind of what led me into kind of like digging more into my Mennonite roots, is sort of thinking about how I'm complicit in what so-called Canada and how Canada was made, and how I can start to dismantle that using some of the amazing lessons that Mennonites have kind of learned over the years, like communal living and like, you know, home is where the language is, or home, you know, instead of this piece of land, you know. I think those are great ways to start thinking and thinking about, you know, stewardship and cooperation with the land. So yeah, I think that it almost, you know, these things were like kind of rumbling under the surface, but kind of the changes of 2020 almost like amplified them or made them even more vital conversations that
Absolutely.
I'm really pleased to be involved with you, Diana, and Adrienne as well, to chat about. Like, they've been really great and fruitful conversations, and I think that I hope there's more. It's scary and it's hard to be brave enough to kind of like, you know, talk about our own complicit, you know, and our own whiteness and our own, you know, that there needs to be change that needs to happen like right now. So
thank you. And I just wanted to sort of speak to that a bit and ask you another follow-up question, which is that I think in at least my Mennonite side of my family, these stories of oppression and these stories of like persecution that we've faced elsewhere. And there's this story that we faced persecution somewhere else. We were forced to migrate to this other place, but then through hard work, we were able to succeed. But as I say, the pairing with this exhibition, with the Samath Hotza exhibition, that really underscores that success, as predicated as it is on hard work, it's also only made possible because of a previous theft of Indigenous lands and the dispossession of other people. And it's without it being, you know, the Mennonite community's fault. They didn't force that to happen, but they still benefited from it, and still just changing the conversation. So it's you know, it's not the pain Olympics, it's not the oppression Olympics, that because we were oppressed at one point, we can't also be complicit in another group's oppression. One of the things that I learned from Diana as we were preparing this exhibition, how many of you all have been told the story about how Mennonites were invited by Catherine the Great of Russia to come and occupy and farm an area of the Ukraine? Hands up. Everybody? Everybody. Right. Cool. So I've heard that story like dozens of times from my Mennonite family, but it was only from reading something that Diana wrote that I learned that land in the Ukraine was available to be farmed because it had been stolen away from the original inhabitants, and they had been dispossessed and moved outwards. So again, these stories that we tell ourselves over and over again, like it's a similar history that's happening in the 20th century in the Fraser Valley, as happened 400 years ago under Catherine the Great of Russia. But acknowledging our situatedness in that history, and your work really does very much try to insert yourself into your family histories in a way that takes responsibility for what position you occupy. So I really appreciate that. I was wondering if you would speak just a little bit, if you don't mind, about the value co-op work that you're doing, and how you see that relating to your work as an artist, obviously, but also the idea of co-ops and unions, how you see those as being an important part of how we get through 2020 and whatever's going on with the world.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just add that, like, while our, draining of Sumas Lake or any other, it wasn't, like you say, it wasn't Mennonite's fault, but it also wasn't not our fault. Like like you can, yeah, I think that we need to take responsibility, as you're saying, for that. And, we were acting in a way that our culture has taught us to act for, hundreds of years. And so we also have made a mess in a lot of places, and it is up to us to clean it up. But yeah, and so to that end, kind of trying to find alternatives to this sort of runaway train that is capitalism. I've been really, I started researching into Mennonites and into other groups that do share the land communally and use things in a more communal way, and other forms of communal living. And part of that research has been, I've helped to found a co-op for artists and cultural workers in the Lower Mainland, in a model that is a more equitable way of making money and of getting people flexible living income jobs. So we founded Value Co-op, which is Vancouver Artist and Labor Union Cooperative, and it's aimed to provide living wage and flexible employment for arts and cultural workers in Vancouver. But we have put in place at the foundation. So cooperative means one member, one vote. So everybody there, it's a democratic decision-making model, or a consensus decision-making model, where there is no manager, there's no hierarchies. That we've also put into place at the base layer that there has to be at least 50% racialized people as employees and also on the board, so that there's always, racialized people always have more votes than the white people within the cooperative. And we're trying to use the cooperative, we mainly make swag and sell to unions, so it's like a production studio space. We do video production and we do some branding, but we've created a union called the Arts and Cultural Workers Union that is also unionizing other artist-run spaces, or just art organizations. And we're trying to use the union to push for real social change. So using it as a vehicle to push organizations to be more equitable, and to look at how they're paying their workers, and to look at the makeup of their board and the makeup of their employees, and try to kind of push for better models and more equitable representation and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's kind of one of those things that, sometimes it feels like as an artist, you're slowly making these your cultural research and cultural production, and it takes a very long time for that to sort of trickle into the mainstream. And so the cooperative to me is sort of a way to try to push something a little bit faster, and to feel like some of the ideas I'm getting and the things I'm thinking about don't just have an outlet in the art, which, I mean, obviously an outlet in the art is amazing, but it's just taking too long for change to happen. So it's hopefully a model to kind of speed things up and be a little more practical, on the ground force for change, at least, in my community here, and a model that could spread across Canada. Yeah. So if anyone's interested in starting one in their own city, just get at me.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I wanted to add, that it's interesting that you're looking back to sort of historical Mennonite, cooperative living models as a potential guide for this anti-capitalist or sort of post-capitalist, perhaps, way of organizing labor. And so important, as you say, that racialized groups are at the table and in positions of decision-making authority. This actually leads me to some thoughts on Lois's practice. So I wonder if, Lois, would you mind weighing in on sort of how you've been navigating through 2020? And I'm very interested in, especially in how invested your practice is in collaboration, and whether that too might be a lifeline for those of us arts and culture workers to try to move forward in these strange times.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued, Emily, with your initiatives. I hadn't heard about it, but I really want to find out more. And I also really appreciate, again, you're outing me. Reading the Migration Library really is about collaboration, and that often gets missed because the topic of migration is so timely, and that's why the project is there, is because I think we all want to respond to issues of migration and also settlement, which you've already brought up a few times. So yeah, this moment is a very contradictory moment, very difficult. Not for me personally, thank goodness, but it's a very difficult time for our culture and around the world. I think the pandemic has allowed me to kind of stay at home. It's actually forced me to change entire topic of work. I was in the US on a fellowship when it happened, so I had to leave behind that work, which was on the South US border in Texas. You know, I couldn't do my field work there. So I came home and focused more on reading the Migration Library, and managed to get it to a more I don't know, a more complete stage, I guess. Basically staying home and working on it, as opposed to going to a lot of events and spending a lot of time with groups of people. So I was working one-on-one with people using Zoom and phone calls and whatnot. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that time. But it's also, as everyone knows, this time of huge reckoning with the, you know, biggest kind of problems facing our societies and the global context. We can't help but see how inequitable everything is. And then, yeah, we've been on this trajectory of race reckoning. The pandemic did not invent that, that's for sure. So I've been really amazed at how these ideas, particularly relating to my heritage, I'll use that word for now, you know, how available information is about what the Russian Mennonite story is, or, you know, the opportunity to look at it critically. I remember for many years wanting to encounter, not that I was researching, because I wasn't, and maybe if I had done some research, I would have encountered it earlier, but I was really curious about the religious and cultural history of the Russian Mennonites. And it seems like now that is more available. Before that, it was always sort of written by people who were really invested in staying Mennonite or being Mennonite or committing to supporting the Mennonite diaspora for what it is, which is a religious community predominantly. And now it seems the histories are more available, or at least I've encountered them more. So I've learned things about my Russian Mennonite heritage, particularly about the sort of state of settlement in Russia, and yeah, how the Mennonites were enabled to settle there as European settlers at the moment when the ethnic Ukrainians were sort of gaining emancipation. And so it was a way of suppressing them in the midst of their moment of opportunity for some political agency, economic agency. And also, I was really surprised to read that the Mennonites were invited to live, and I only have one reference for this, but they were invited to have that lifestyle tax-free. And that's something that, you know, I can't imagine would have been circulated in my background. And maybe not many people know about that. But also, yeah, here in Canada, so, you know, we came, or the Mennonites, I don't like to personify people of the past, because that isn't, I'm not that person. But, you know, they are people from my heritage or my ancestry. Yeah, the method of colonization is a very well practiced method by various states, including, of course, Canada. And we can't sort of attribute that all to our ancestors. You know, they followed a path that was kind of invented or evolved. European colonization evolved over many, many, many centuries. And but the Mennonites and our religion, it really suited that kind of task. So it's really, really important that we understand it and know what it produced. Here in Canada, it's really obvious now. And it continues, you know, really high functioning white communities, whether they're religiously based or otherwise, have so many privileges to this day. And it's very difficult, I think, for those communities and those individuals to actually learn about what's at stake for the Indigenous people who have been displaced. But that's becoming harder and harder to avoid. But as I say, I think that this moment of racial reckoning seems very emergent, but it's not emergent. This moment has been a long time in the making, and I'm really hoping that we can keep it moving. And I think that's inevitable because of the resurgence of calls for sovereignty that come from young people. So I think their voices are just undeniable. So I'm really hoping to be able to hear them and work with them.
You anticipate that, I know you're concentrating now on reading the Migration Library and working further on that because perhaps other projects have been complicated by the COVID shutdown and whatnot. Do you see then that incorporating more of those stories into reading the Migration Library and working with more of those young people through collaboration is how you see yourself and your practice being involved in this present moment? Or do you see other work of your own that you feel that you will make independently? Or do you feel like collaboration is really the way forward for you right now?
That's a good question. I would say, yeah, the way you've described it is pretty accurate. I'll continue to work on these collaborations, and there is one that's coming in the new year with Leah Decter, an artist from Winnipeg who, an academic, and her academic work really looks at how settler artists are kind of listening to the anti-colonial moment that we're in, and how they're working to fulfill or to support Indigenous resurgence. Mm-hmm. So her book will be about her travels on Indigenous territories and how, as a settler artist and academic, she has to learn protocols and how complex that is. So she is collaborating with two Indigenous artists. And so all of that will be put together.
Yeah. She's another artist who comes to mind, like yourself, someone who is whose entire practice is really rooted in collaboration, and in her case, like collaboration with Indigenous artists and peoples exclusively. But that as a white arts worker in Canada, that can be a way that we participate in these conversations and perhaps these revolutions that are happening, without continually drawing the attention back to our own white voices and our own white positionality. So I really appreciate your answer, and thank you. Diana, did you have a question for Candice or Emily?
Yeah, I'll start with asking asking Candice to respond more generally to how you're dealing with 2020 and all that has come with this year, and or a follow-up question about how your work deals with public memory and public space, especially in relation to monuments. And as Adrienne and I have been discussing your work and your practice, your work has come up in relation to the battles that have erupted around historical monuments, both in Canada and the US and in Britain. So there's a lot there for you to pick and choose to what you want to respond to.
I have many things to say. I'll try to be concise. To kind of riff off of what Emily and Lois, some of the things you were touching on, and one thing that I think is left out from, I'll come back to your question more directly, is left out from Mennonite narratives, and Russian Mennonite narratives specifically, is a discussion of empire. So that Catherine the Great, who in former Soviet republics is called Catherine the Second, because everyone's like, she was not great. It was an active empire, and Mennonites coming from what was then Russia to Manitoba was an active empire. So, and Amelie, remind me, I have references for you for the history of Métis land titles and Mennonites being very aware of taking Métis land titles in the 1800s. But this idea of recently, when I was, I'm working on a project in Odessa right now in Ukraine, and when I was there last year researching, I was speaking with a historian who we were speaking about the kind of the Reformation in the 16th century and the birth of Anabaptists and the Mennonite movement, and we were talking about the Cossacks, who were a similar group that were an ethnocultural group that arose out of a very specific movement, a kind of, for lack of a more specific term, like Ukrainian independence movement, anti-empire, that were in fact had their headquarters where Mennonites were invited to settle on Hortitsa Island. So it was not even just that we were used as active pawns, I would say, to resettle this displaced territory. It was, we were displacing people that we had so much in common with a few hundred years earlier. So this idea of what displacement does and how, Emily, you were talking about how much we can draw on certain parts of our culture and history, and how much those certain parts of our culture and history have also been instrumentalized to oppress others. I think this is what I try to draw on, and how I'll connect to your question, Diana, that we have choices, that we make choices in what we do with our relationship to empire and our relationship to colonialism and our relationship to whiteness in this moment. So that I've been thinking a lot about, for instance, the MCC was set up as mutual aid after the Russian Revolution, Civil War, and the famines. And I mean, and we could talk about what MCC is now, it's something else, but the potential for drawing on mutual aid, for our history of credit unions, for our history of, communal insurance systems of well-being. These are things that I find really, really inspiring and exciting. And in my work, I'm really interested in kind of looking at the structure of the thing in order to be kind of clear about my decisions about the thing. In terms of, politics, public memory, public space. On a very personal level, the pandemic's been difficult because I kind of lost my apartment, and my stuff was all in Chicago, and I was supposed to be traveling for several months to do research, and I had exhibitions, etc. So it was personally difficult. And it was very difficult to think, and it was, you know, hard, yeah, I obviously didn't have a studio to work in, but it was, in this other way, it like kind of released me from a lot of the pressure that I think that a lot of us feel in trying to hustle in a gig economy and not having savings or employment, regular employment, and things like this. And on a community level, I mean, the overdoses, homelessness, mental health crisis, these things have all been racist attacks. All these things have been very present in my life with my friends and my communities. So it's a strange time, but it's in a way, yeah, like I won't repeat what other people have said, that the capitalist colonial system is bearing its teeth, and it's very clear where the violence is happening, and very clear where people are organizing and responding. And for me, this is, I feel strengthened by this, by the collective movements that have been rising up. And it's affected my work in the sense that it's helped me strengthen my commitment to solidarity. And I think sometimes I can get distracted with my research or how an exhibition is going to turn out. And as we were talking about this exhibition, I had 3 or 4 exhibitions canceled or reworked. And my immediate reaction to all of them was just to adjust and see what was necessary, and see how we could redivert funds, or how we could, how resources could be moved around, and to not worry too much about a career. You know, this is not, I've never had much of a career, and I'm in my 40s now. And so I felt like my immediate reaction was to kind of just be as flexible as possible, and to see how I could support those around me. And in terms of my actual work, I think my work often deals with like a sense of urgency, both materially and conceptually. And seeing my work, like we spoke, you know, when the museum shut down, we spoke soon after, but I was really thinking through, partly from the conditions of neoliberal capitalism that we're living in. My work had already become quite portable. I don't have storage. I've been living and working and traveling a lot across places. So, you know, when the museum shut down, I was like, well, my banner could be rolled up and it could be a bed, like someone could sleep on it. It's not an issue. The structure of it could be taken apart. I don't work with, I mean, the technician built the structure there, but I never work with glue, so that I can always take things apart and they can be reused or they can be burned, etc. A lot of my work I had to throw away in Chicago because I couldn't afford to ship it. So it was used, you know, a fireplace. Some of it was just installed in public space, and it was the kind of work that would disintegrate. And the plastic bags at the museum at the Reach, you know, could be used as plastic bags, which are absolutely necessary in an emergency. So I think it affirmed my approach to working, which is also quite Russian Mennonite. And I would say I really identify with the cultural parts of, less with the religious kind of strains. But I identify with the cultural parts. And the more I visit former Soviet republics, and I visit with my family in Kazakhstan, and I travel in Ukraine, I see how much we are Eastern European, and in some ways quite Soviet, at least my Soviet family. And I see the kind of relationship to working with very little, and always kind of things having a use, which also resonates with folk art, actually. I think that I see a lot of conceptual materialist work as folk art. So that's a long response.
No, thank you. It was very rich. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I love how, yeah, you referenced that conversation that we had when the pandemic had, you know, was starting to affect our daily lives, where we lived, and we were inhabiting that space, and how you were so flexible with how your work was being displayed. And how that speaks to this thread of monument and anti-monument.
Oh yeah, I didn't really respond to that part, but Yeah, I could say a lot about that, but I'll save it for someone else.
That's okay. Okay, yeah, thank you so much for your response. Emily, so just a follow up for Emily, your practice is so deeply invested in storytelling and how through narratives we can make space for multiple perspectives and ways of knowing. Have you felt that 2020 has reinforced the importance of storytelling for you?
I'm not sure how to answer that.
Do you want to just, how do you feel about 2020?
Yeah,
How have you felt
I feel like
it
I'm
impacting you?
living day by day at the moment. When school shut down, I've been homeschooling since March, and then my kids, I have 2 boys, they just went back to school in September. But I feel like a lot of my time has been just dealing with parenting all of a sudden, like really full on parenting, but and reading. There's been so many resources put out since March that I've been kind of working. Like I'm in a book club, and we've got this whole new reading agenda. So I've been slowly working through some books. One that I just finished, The Skin We're In. So I'm also thinking of what's happening, within Canada and Black Lives Matter. How I'm translating this information to my kids. They're listening, they're hearing about what's happening. They're 6 years old and 10 years old. And so my 10-year-old, we listened to the debate last week, and he's got political opinions now, and it's interesting. I feel like my responsibility mainly at this moment is to learn and teach my kids so that they're part of a change. Like when he's 18 and he can vote, or when my kids can vote, like I'm thinking like things will really, I'm hoping, shift in really dramatic ways, within 8 years. Like I'm curious to see down the line how things are in 8 years from now, because of all of this forward movement that's happening everywhere, all across Canada. There's people are standing up and voicing everything. I feel like there's more information now than there's ever been. Maybe that's just my Instagram feed is now educating me on what's happening. And I find that useful. Like I find it actually a useful news source. When people are videotaping what's happening right now, like what protests are going on right at this moment that are missed in, the news or Saskatchewan news. It's really interesting to see what's happening. It's overwhelming. I don't always know on a personal level what I can do or how. I mean, it's so interesting, Emily, to hear about your actions. There's certain things that I've done for a long time that I feel like are also amplified in my life, where I've been supporting local farmers for a long time, buying my groceries, 2 blocks away at the market box, where they're, all of the food coming in is from local farmers. So supporting that system, feels like the right thing to do. I got really interested in growing things as soon as we were able to grow things. And as far as my project goes, I've been able to keep going with editing, and I was able to get to Manitoba to do 2 film shoots during the pandemic. So it felt a little bit like I was sneaking out of the province, but I got on a plane 2 weeks ago and flew to Winnipeg and was able to shoot the harvest season with my aunt. So that feels, every time I can gather more information from her, that's going to hopefully get me through the winter as far as editing goes. And then, everything's canceled. So there's this calmness and focus that comes with the pandemic. I think I had my last exhibition that was sitting, waiting, that's postponed till 2021, 2022, or who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows when. So I am, also rethinking how I'm going to put this out into the world at some point. I have, it looks like it may end up being almost like feature-length film, which I wasn't planning on. It was supposed to be a 10-minute long short. So now I'm thinking maybe releasing like 5-minute episodes of Auntie Agatha's life. According to topic. We'll see, we'll see what happens with it. Right now, it's there's very many topics, and it's hard to figure out exactly how to break it all down.
I appreciate what you had to say, Emily, though, about your reading group. Diana and I are both part of a reading group here at work as well, reading Black Lives Matter titles and working through that as a staff. And I think like just the willingness to keep educating ourselves and to learn. This is now, I think, going to be one of, if not the most important aspect of my job for as long as I have a job, is working to try to be a good ally in the arts. And I was saying, like, none of my education or my previous experience has actually prepared me to do that part of my job, but now it's incumbent upon me to get better at that part of my job. Otherwise, I should vacate this position for someone else who can. And I think that just being humble and acknowledging that I don't have a background in this, and I'm starting now and will work as hard as I can to try to get up to speed, because it's the obligation of anyone who occupies a position like Diana and I do as the curators, and I'm interested also in like the role of artists as well, for all of you also being part of that process, that working collaboratively, or making anti-monuments, or forming a co-op, or growing vegetables in a garden and supporting local workers, that this is also an important aspect of how we change the dominant narrative in the art world in Canada as well. So I just wanted to throw that bomb out there at the very end.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of your responses. There is such an important, this is an important time to take the time to educate ourselves and continue that education, and to sit back and take action in whatever ways we can. So thank you all.
Does anyone have any final comments, anything that they'd like to share, or any plugs that you want to put in there for projects coming up if things aren't all canceled?
I will very quickly add onto what both Diana and Adrienne you just said, that it's also incumbent upon artists. It's not just for people in positions of power in institutions. I mean, it's for everyone. And as artists, I think we can ask ourselves a series of questions on a regular basis of how our practices relate to decolonization, whether you're an abstract painter or you're working with monuments. And I wanted to say quickly about, I forgot to add anything to my response about your question about monuments, but that to watch these monuments fall, I watched on video, I watched the John A. Macdonald monument get destroyed in Montreal and his head fall off and roll down the pavement. I just watched a video of a colonial monument in Santa Fe get pulled down that activists have been trying for years through legal means to get removed in New Mexico. And what I see happening in its place is like people taking up public space in a very different way, protesting, but also occupying the space that monuments once held. And in places like Minneapolis, a friend just went to Minneapolis and visited the George Floyd monument, who was murdered by Minneapolis police in May. And the monument there is ever expanding, ever growing. It's the whole street's taken over. There's art, there's a garden, and it's cared for and it's visited and it's tended. And to really think about monuments as active spaces that need maintenance and care and construction is the thing that I kind of take away from that. And from you, it's your job, it's my job as a curator or a director or an artist to think about how we participate in the construction of public memory and public space at this time. And to bring it back to what you said earlier about Mennonites, occupying a space in some ways of kind of thinking of ourselves as outside or as ever elsewhere. offers the two possibilities of choice, or two directions of allowing that to kind of be away from responsibility or to move towards that responsibility. And so I thank you for this conversation, and for all the artists to really be able to have a really kind of honest and direct conversation about these things. And we can plug right now All Eyes on Mi'kma'ki and the fishers that are facing white terrorism, white supremacist terrorism, really from white and non-Indigenous fishers in defending their treaty rights and practice for fishing. So that's something that I wanted to plug before we go.
Thank you very much, Candice. And I am also just very, very appreciative of all of your work and all of the conversations that I've had with all of you. I myself have, think partly because of this exhibition, I've also started to try to reckon with my relationship to Mennonitism, whatever it is. So I appreciate that you've been with me as we've tried to figure that out. So I just want to say thank you all for joining. I hope that you'll have a chance to see the exhibition in person at some point in some way, shape, or form. Thank you all, and I appreciate your time. Diana, did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, just I wanted to say thank you all for your time.